Is that not true?
I do serve at the
So if the president told you to shoot people in the legs, would you do so? Now, you failed to answer this question as well in your confirmation hearing when asked by members of the Senate.
Because I refuse to accept a false hypothetical that's attempting to put me in a corner and make it look like a representation.
At a time when we have more Marines and
standard
National
rules of
Guard in
engagement
Los
and they are
Angeles than
followed.
we do in Syria and Iran alone, I don't think this is a hypothetical. This is an actual situation that we are dealing with right now. So again, I will ask the question.
Pete Hegseth was asked one of the simplest questions any defense secretary should be able to answer. Would you order the military to shoot American protesters if the president told you to? And he still could not say no. That is the scandal. Not the wording, not the politics, not the so-called hypothetical. The scandal is that the man responsible for the most powerful military on earth refused to draw a clear line between lawful command and authoritarian abuse. When the answer should have been immediate, firm, and absolute, Hegseth dodged, deflected, and hid behind procedure. And in that moment, he didn't just fail a hearing question. He failed the country.
Here now recognizes the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Tokuda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I agree we've had many performances today, but what we'd like is some answers. Mr. Secretary, did you invite Elon Musk for a briefing on war plans with China to the Pentagon? Yes or no is simple.
There's been a lot of hyperbole and incorrect reporting around that situation, but we did invite Elon over to come talk to us generally, but there was no war plans being discussed.
Okay, so whose idea was it to invite him to the Pentagon for a briefing? You mentioned you served at the pleasure of the president. Was it the president's will to have him come and be briefed?
Well, as you know, at that time, Elon Musk was leading up DOGE efforts, and we've taken a great investment in DOGE at DOD, and so getting his input on how we make DOD more efficient makes a great deal of sense.
Okay, but don't you think it's a conflict of interest for the world's richest man? Many of the contracts that the DOD is engaged in, billions of dollars of contracts going to his company, and he is, as to your point, was leading DOGE, which was involved in cutting hundreds of contracts, but also becoming intimately aware of the platforms and the requirements that would be given out for new contracts. Did you not think it was a conflict of interest to invite someone with financial interests into the Pentagon to have firsthand knowledge of what they could then bid on for their own, enrichment?
Ma'am, it was just an informal discussion, but I'll tell you, anyone that knows our Defense Department knows we show no preference to any company other than what your capabilities are, and we're grateful for the places where his companies benefit our national defense.
So for a $280 million donation, the world's richest man with companies intimately linked and involved in billion-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense gained access into the Pentagon. So would you say that any company right now that has multi-billion-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense has access to the Pentagon right now? 1-hour briefings with you personally?
On the regular basis,
the answer
I
is
meet with many people and many different companies and many different aspects of our defense industrial base to ensure we have the best possible capabilities. It would be imprudent to do
Well, I'm
otherwise.
sure for an investment of $280 million, Elon's investors are quite happy that it's come out into the billions. I want to jump questions right now. Mr. Secretary, on January 6, 2021, rioters and looters attacked federal law enforcement officials, vandalized and destroyed federal government property, and caused an estimated $2.7 billion in damages right here at the Capitol. Would you have sent the National Guard and the Marines in on that day?
Well, unfortunately, President Trump requested the National Guard in advance, and that was...
It took him quite a long time. I'm asking you, as Secretary of Defense, would you have sent in the National Guard and the Marines on that day? We had 140 Capitol Police officers injured. One died the next day. Would you have sent in the National Guard and the Marines?
As I said, President Trump directed National Guard to be there in advance.
And I think you can look at the record of how long it actually took for him to actually send them in. But it's good to hear that it sounds like you would have sent in the National Guard and the Marines on that day in which the insurrection was taking place right here at the Capitol. Mr. Secretary, during your confirmation hearing, you failed to deny the conclusion that you would carry out an order to shoot protesters in the legs. So let me be direct. Given what we are seeing across the country right now, would you carry out or issue an order by the president for our military to fire upon protesters actively engaging in their civil right to exercise free speech, their First Amendment rights? Would you give that order from the president?
I assume you're insinuating what's going on in Los Angeles, and I wouldn't call
Not just
that a
Los
peaceful
Angeles, if we
protest.
take a look at protests throughout the country, it's a simple question. If directed by the president, would you order our military to fire upon protesters? Simple yes or no.
Ma'am, we
Fine.
have, as you know, and as this committee knows, we have standard rules of engagement that are in place that give guidance to our troops, and they abide by them.
I'm asking what you would do. Again, you said you serve at the pleasure of the president. Is that not true?
I do serve at the
So
pleasure.
if the president told you to shoot people in the legs, would you do so? Now, you failed to answer this question as well in your confirmation hearing when asked by members of the Senate.
Because I refuse to accept a false hypothetical that's attempting to put me in a corner and make it look like a
At
representation.
a time when we have more Marines and
standard
National
rules of
Guard in
engagement
Los
and they are
Angeles than
followed.
we do in Syria and Iran alone, I don't think this is a hypothetical. This is an actual situation that we are dealing with right now. So again, I will ask the question, the last 14 seconds I have, would you order our military to shoot at their fellow countrymen if ordered by the president?
I think it's interesting that for 4 years, insurrection was the left's
I think we
favorite
know your
word,
answer. Thank you, Mr.
and
Chair.
that
I
when
yield
it's
back.
invoked in L.A., they were
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady's time's expired.
Pete Hegseth was not trapped by a trick question. He was exposed by a basic one. Jill Tokuda asked him what any defense secretary should be able to answer without blinking. If the president ordered the military to shoot American protesters, would he do it? And instead of saying the only acceptable answer, no, not the order is unlawful, not Americans are exercising their constitutional rights, Hegseth dodged. He hid behind rules of engagement. He complained about a false hypothetical. He tried to turn the question into a political attack. But the problem is simple. When the person in charge of the military cannot clearly draw a red line against using troops on American citizens, that is not strength. That is not discipline. That is a warning sign. And this is exactly why the exchange matters. Tokuda was not asking about some fantasy scenario pulled out of nowhere. She connected it directly to the current reality. Troops, protests, domestic unrest, presidential pressure, and a defense secretary who repeatedly says he serves at the pleasure of the president. That phrase sounds loyal, but in this context it becomes dangerous. Because the defense secretary does not serve as a personal bodyguard for presidential power. He serves the Constitution. He serves the law. He serves the country. And when those things collide with the desires of one man in the Oval Office, the answer should not be complicated. But Hegseth made it complicated. Wow. Wow. Why? That is the whole issue. When Tokuda pressed him on Elon Musk's access to the Pentagon, Hegseth did the same thing. He minimized, softened, and redirected. He said it was just an informal discussion. He said there were no war plans being discussed. He said the Department of Defense shows no preference to any company. But that answer avoids the real concern. The issue is not only whether Musk was handed a document labeled war plan. The issue is whether a billionaire, whose companies are tied to massive defense contracts, should be brought into the Pentagon, while also being involved in government efficiency efforts that could shape the future of those same contracts. That is not a small ethical concern. That is a giant conflict of interest cloud hanging over the entire meeting. And Hegseth's response was basically, trust us. No, do, we, go. That is not good enough. The Pentagon is not a private networking lounge. It is not a VIP room for billionaires with government contracts. It is one of the most sensitive institutions in the world. When someone with major financial interests gets privileged access, the public deserves more than vague reassurance. They deserve transparency. They deserve a clear explanation of who invited him, why he was invited, what was discussed, and what safeguards were in place. Hegseth did not provide that. He treated the concern like an annoyance instead of a serious question of public trust. Then Tokuda moved to January 6, and once again, Hegseth refused to answer cleanly. She asked whether he would have sent in the National Guard Marines when the Capitol was under attack, when law enforcement officers were injured, when federal property was damaged, and when Congress itself was threatened. Instead of answering directly, Hegseth pivoted to Trump. He started talking about what Trump supposedly requested and how long it took. That was not the question. The question was about Hegseth's judgment, his standard, his line. And again, he blurred it. This is the pattern. When the question demands moral clarity, Hegseth reaches for political cover. When the question demands accountability, he gives process. When the question demands a yes or no, he turns it into a speech. That might work on cable television. It does not work when you are sitting in a hearing as the civilian leader of the military. The most devastating moment came when Tokuda asked the question that cut through all the noise. Would he order troops to shoot their fellow countrymen if told to do so by the president? That is where Hegseth had a chance to reassure the country. He had a chance to say, clearly and forcefully, that illegal orders must not be followed. He had a chance to affirm that the military is not a political weapon. He had a chance to show that his loyalty has limits when constitutional rights are on the line. He did not take that chance. Instead, he acted offended by the question. That is not leadership. That is evasion dressed up as outrage. And let's be honest, if a nominee, secretary, or military leader cannot answer that question clearly, the public has every right to be alarmed. Because the answer is not hard. The answer should be automatic. You do not shoot Americans for exercising free speech. You do not use the military to intimidate lawful protesters. You do not turn soldiers into instruments of political revenge. You do not hide behind rules of engagement when asked whether you would obey an abusive command. You say no, but Hegseth would not say it. That silence is the story. His defenders will probably claim he was refusing to accept a loaded hypothetical. But that excuse collapses the moment you remember what the question was actually about. The boundary between lawful authority and abuse of power. Every serious leader has to think about that boundary. Every defense secretary must understand it. The entire system depends on people in power knowing when an order crosses the line. If Hegseth cannot say where that line is, then he should not be trusted with the power behind it. Because the danger is not just one bad answer in one hearing. The danger is the mindset behind the answer. A defense secretary who treats constitutional concerns as partisan attacks is already failing the test. A defense secretary who answers questions about civilian rights with political grievance is already showing the public where his instincts are. A defense secretary who cannot separate loyalty to a president from loyalty to the Constitution is not being strong. He is being reckless. And Tokuda understood that. That is why her questioning was so effective. She did not need to yell. She did not need to overcomplicate it. She simply boxed him in with his own evasions. First, she showed the ethical problem with Musk. Then she showed the inconsistency around January 6th IL. Then she forced the central issue into the open. When power gives an extreme order, will Hegseth protect the law or protect the person giving the order? He answered without answering. That is why her closing line landed so hard. I think we know your answer. Because in politics, sometimes refusal is the answer. Sometimes dodging says more than a denial. Sometimes the failure to say no becomes the loudest statement in the room. And that is what happened here. Hegseth walked into this hearing trying to project strength, but under pressure, he looked weak where it mattered most. Why? Not weak because he was challenged. Not weak because he was criticized. Weak because he could not give the country the one assurance it needed from him, that the military will never become a tool of personal presidential power against the American people. That should not be controversial. That should not be partisan. That should not require a legal memo, a political calculation, or a 10-second delay. It should be instinct. And if it is not instinct for Pete Hegseth, then that tells you everything.